Hi, welcome to this week's Mindset Lesson video. I have two tips for you this week that are really going to help you in making sure that you're practicing your letter sounds or phonemes correctly with your child. This is such an important foundational skill. We practice these letter sounds because this is what your child is going to use later on when they're learning to read and when they're decoding words, when they're segmenting words, to be able to spell properly. And so it's critically important that you get the pronunciation of these phonemes correct as much as you possibly can. The good news is that there's a couple of tips. Two of them, if you keep these two things in mind as you're practicing the letter sounds, then you are going to be well on your way to having that solid foundation, and you're going to be able to avoid most of the most common things that trip us up when we're practicing phonemes. So I'm going to share these two tips with you, and I've already talked a little bit about them before in other videos, but let's focus in on these today. So the first tip is to really keep in mind as you're practicing each individual letter sound, whether it's supposed to be voiced or unvoiced. And the test for this is for voiced consonants, ones that you use your voice box to make, like for instance, the sound of the letter B, ba, ba, ba. So you're using your voice box to make that sound, and when you put your hand on your throat as you say it, ba, then you can feel your voice box vibrating. And you should teach this to your child as they practice those voiced sounds so that they can tell that they're making the sound correctly, they can feel their voice box vibrating. And then, those are the easier ones. The unvoiced ones are a little bit trickier, and so you almost teach them this trick so that they can tell the difference between the voiced and the unvoiced, because then when they go to make an unvoiced sound, for instance, the letter F, you don't use your voice to make that sound. You're supposed to use just your breath, and there's no vibration, or there should be no vibration as you pronounce the phoneme. So as your child practices those, you should teach them to do that test and make sure that they're not using their voice box to make it. So that's the first tip, paying attention to which ones are supposed to be voiced and which ones are supposed to be unvoiced. And as we go through each letter, I try to let you know which one is which. And so if you just keep that in mind and you do that little test and you prompt your child to do that little test, then that's the first step to making sure that you're practicing these sounds correctly. So if your child is voicing unvoiced phonemes, there's usually one reason for it. They're usually adding a vowel sound to the end, and grown-ups do this too. Like, it's a very, very common thing to do, and I'll tell you why in a second. But if you're adding a vowel sound to the end of an unvoiced consonant, that's called a schwa. It's that sound. So maybe instead of saying f, you're saying f. Or for instance, in the letter P, instead of saying p, you're saying p. And sometimes we say that when we're prompting our child to practice the sound, and we're really trying to enunciate it, or maybe we're speaking a little bit more loudly to be heard and to really get that sound across to your child, because the unvoiced sounds tend to be a little quiet. They're unvoiced, right? So we're almost whispering them. We're just using our breath. And so sometimes in an attempt to really enunciate the sound for our child, we are unintentionally adding this vowel sound to the end. And what that has the effect of doing is making it voiced. So instead of f, it's f. And you definitely want to avoid doing that, and you want to avoid having your child do that, because you're essentially then you're saying two sounds. You're saying the original consonant sound, and then you're saying that schwa sound, or that vowel sound. And you're adding that vowel sound in there where it shouldn't be. Later on, if they've learned their letter sounds this way and they're adding schwas to the end, so this leads me to my second tip. It's sort of bridges the gap between tip 1 and tip 2, because this is something you should look for if your child is voicing unvoiced letter sounds. It's usually because they're adding a schwa to the end of it. And then that leads directly into step 2, which is don't add schwas, whether it's to voiced consonants or unvoiced. Don't add schwas to the end of any of them. And the reason that we have a tendency to do this is not only in this sort of attempt to enunciate these sounds better, we do it even to the voiced ones. It's very common to practice these sounds, and for instance to say, B says ba instead of b, and the reason is that it sounds really incomplete to us. We're used to hearing vowels with our consonants, and saying b and d, it sounds really truncated and really unusual to us. And so we often, very unintentionally, just because it sounds better to our ear, it sounds more natural to us, we're adding in those schwa sounds. So you want to definitely watch yourself and watch your child to make sure those schwa sounds aren't getting added in, because as they then go later on to decode words when they're learning how to read, and or to segment words as they're writing, if they're adding those schwa sounds in there, the word isn't going to come out as it should. It's going to be much harder for them to decode words. They're going to have a tendency to spell things incorrectly just because they weren't making those initial sounds or those initial phonemes properly. So if you pay attention closely to those two things, the voiced and unvoiced letter sounds, and then that will be a clue to you. Like if you're catching yourself or your child voicing unvoiced sounds, then you're probably adding a schwa to the end of it. And so then if you're paying close attention to that as well, and making sure that the schwas aren't going on the ends of these letter sounds, then you are going to be the majority of the way there as far as keeping bad habits out of this skill, and really laying a strong foundation of proper letter sounds that your child can build on later for reading and spelling and literacy, which is what this is all about. So those two simple tips, just keep those in mind, and then know that you are so far on your way to being there and to giving your child really awesome skills that's going to make it so much easier for them later on. So I hope you enjoy using this week. Maybe go back and review the letter sounds that you've learned so far, and just run through all of them and make sure that you feel confident in how you're pronouncing them, and apply these two tips, and yeah, go forward, and we'll see you next time.